Okay, so in this video, students, we're going to be looking at the four elements of a state in continuation of our discussion on nation states. And when we talk about the elements of a state, we're talking about the core, the substance, and the significance of a state. Every state that is a state must have these elements to be viable, must have these elements to be recognized, and must have these elements to be effective. So when we talk about elements of a state, we are talking about what constitutes a state. When does a state say, we are now a state? When does a territory or a people say, we are now a state? These are the elements we're talking about. Now, in the previous lecture, we talked about statehood and defined statehood and talked about what statehood is all about and the driving force for statehood. We also talked about self-determination and the effort for political independence. Here we're talking about the elements of a state. All right, so let's take a closer look at this core concept and understand what those elements are and how effective they are. The states are the core of this whole idea of statehood. And you have a government, so the state must have a government to be effective. And when we talk about a government, we're talking about a group of people empowered and mandated to, govern the state, to make laws and enact laws and enforce those laws. So a state must have a government, and the government could be elected government, right? It could be elected government, or it could be a government that came to power by force, right? By force. Or it could be a government that is constituted as a result of monarchy, right? And other forms of government as well. But nevertheless, it must have a government. And this is very significant because a government protects its people, a government sets the agenda, a government makes policies, a government, interacts with other governments and other entities on behalf of the people. So the state must have a government, and the state must be sovereign as well, right? And what does that mean, sovereign? It means independent. And here we are talking about political independence, right? It must be independent. So we will talk about political independence. And independence here means it determines its own affairs. There is no interference, or there should be no interference from foreign powers. It determines its own affairs. It's in control of its own policies, right? So let's put that here, in control of its policies. And it determines every aspect of its being. That is sovereignty, suggesting that it can govern itself. And there's also an element of self-sufficiency. This is self-sufficiency. We'll talk about sovereignty. That means you depend on yourself and you depend on your ability to be successful in the international community. And you're able to interact. But sovereignty also means that you are recognized by other entities, right? You're recognized by other entities because you're a sovereign nation and your sovereignty is recognized. So one of the key elements of a state then is sovereignty. If a state doesn't have sovereignty, it cannot call itself a state. Within the context in which we are discussing, it cannot be an independent state. A lot of states don't have sovereignty, they're being ruled by others. They cannot call themselves state in the true sense of the word state. Okay, so we have government, we have sovereignty, and of course, a state must have people. And by people, we mean citizens, right? Citizens. And citizens that pay taxes, citizens that obey the law, citizens that work, of course, and citizens that protect the environment, right? They interact and protect the environment, and citizens that have a contract with the state. Now let's put that here as well. So they have a contract, and it's called a social contract. This is social contract with the state. And that social contract says that you will have certain responsibilities, right? So there are certain responsibilities that the people must perform, and there are certain responsibilities that the state must perform as well. It's a two-way street, right? So the state performs its responsibility of protection, provision, right? And enacting laws, enforcing laws, ensuring law and order, and the people obey the laws, and the people support the laws. The people pay taxes to support programs and projects, and they work to get the economy going for self-sustenance and sufficiency. And of course, the social contract has all of these elements embedded in it. So a state must have people. Without people, there is no state. And the state is not in a vacuum. A state does not operate in a vacuum. The people determine the state. And the people, in that sense, are also connected to the government because they elect the government. So a state must have people. And finally, a state must have territory. There is no state in space. States don't operate in space, they don't operate in cloud, they operate in a physical territory. And the territory is so important because a state must be defined, right? So a territory defines a state. A territory defines a state. And of course, that definition then is recognized, right? The definition is recognized. Let's put that here. So it's recognized around the world, right? So there's a recognition of that state around the world because it has a territory, and the territory is respected. Let's put that here, right? So territory is respected by others, and this is tied to sovereignty. For a country to be sovereign, it must have full control of its territory. It must not cede its territory to other entities. It must not allow other entities to govern any aspect of its territory. And that is part of the sovereignty. And so territory becomes so critical. I would talk about physical territory, where these people we've identified are, space that they occupy. That is a territory. And that territory then must be sovereign and must be respected, right? So a state must have territory. So when we talk about the four elements of a state, we're talking about government, 1, sovereignty, 2, people, 3, and territory, 4. These are the 4 elements of a state. And without these elements, there is no state. If one element is missing, there is no state. If a state doesn't have sovereignty, it's not a state, in the sense in which we are discussing. If it doesn't have people, it's not a state. If it doesn't have a territory, it's not a state. If it doesn't have a government, it's not a state. These are the 4 elements of a state. And we're going to be discussing more of this as we look at nation states and look at the composition of nation states and begin to understand the vitality, the significance and importance of nation states, but more importantly, the role nation states play within their territory, and of course, how they interact with other entities.